Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for everybody in the waiting room to join us, and we'll get going in just a minute.
Buenas noches a todos. Deb, can you hear me if I'm interpreting like that?
I can. We'll need to
Okay.
mute you, Aaron. Yeah. Okay, good evening, and thank you all for being here. My name is Deborah Linden, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's panel discussion about mental illness and navigating the criminal justice system, sponsored by Interim. I'm a member of the Interim Board of Directors and a retired chief of police. We're using Zoom webinar for this presentation, which means you can see us, but we can't see you. We'll be taking written questions during the panel discussion, and we'll have a dedicated question and answer period with our panelists following the discussion. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post your questions in writing. We'll get to as many questions as time permits, and we have Interim staff behind the scenes who'll be responding to some questions in writing. Please don't put your questions in the chat area because we'll miss them. Use the Q&A button instead. But don't ignore the chat, because throughout the webinar, we'll be sharing links and downloads to various resources our panelists will be discussing. If you need English to Spanish interpretation, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and click on the Spanish option. And thank you to the Monterey County Behavioral Health Department for providing our wonderful live interpreters for this webinar. And thank you, Aaron and Luis, for your interpretation skills. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Interim Executive Director, Dr. Rian Katan, also known as Dr. Q. Dr. Q is a licensed psychologist with over 20 years experience in the behavioral health field. He's worked as a behavioral health manager in both Kern and Monterey counties, and has worked with incarcerated youth and adults as a practitioner, supervisor, and administrator. Dr. Q has led collaborative efforts focused on improving access and care for those suffering from mental illness with criminal justice involvement. He believes that service is a gift we can all give, and that through collaboration and partnership, much can be accomplished. Welcome, Dr. Q.
Thank you, Deb. Distinguished panelists, those behind the scenes, and of course, everyone in attendance this evening. Before I review today's topics, I want to acknowledge the gravity of what we'll be discussing, because it can be heavy in various ways. For some, this may be a learning and growth opportunity, and for others, these topics hit very close to home. I imagine that something or someone of great importance brought you here tonight. We want to honor and be respectful of the individual and collective experiences gathered here in this space. With that said, we'll be going over a number of different topics, but our main learning objectives today are to, one, discuss productive ways to engage and share information with professional entities such as law enforcement, behavioral health providers, jails, and hospitals. Two, what crisis intervention training is and how it's used to increase safety for all involved in a crisis situation. Three, roles of justice partners. Four, share the scope, purpose, and benefits of mobile crisis response. Five, mental health treatment and alternative programs in detained and outpatient settings. And six, we'll close with some Q&A with hopes we can provide information we may not otherwise cover throughout this webinar. Lastly, I just want to say that we truly hope that you leave today with a greater sense of how to navigate this world where mental illness intersects with the criminal justice system, whether it's personally or professionally or both. Thank you all again. Back to you, Deb.
Thank you, Dr. Q. We really appreciate your remarks. And now let's meet our panelists. Michelle Wooden began her career in criminal defense in 2004 as a deputy public defender in Monterey County. Since 2001, Michelle has served as chief deputy public defender, where she's currently supervising the misdemeanor, juvenile, and collaborative mental health court teams. Michelle holds Bachelor of Science degrees in psychology and sociology from the University of Utah, and a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of San Diego School of Law. Her purpose and passion are to assist clients with mental health issues who happen to be justice involved. Hi, Michelle, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Deb, for having me.
Monterey County Behavioral Health Deputy Director Melanie Rhodes is a licensed clinician with over 20 years experience working with those impacted by severe mental illness and co-occurring conditions. She oversees the access to treatment, forensic, crisis, and South County services for Monterey County Behavioral Health. She's also the behavioral health liaison with the county jail, courts, and public safety agencies, and coordinates the crisis intervention team. She's passionate about advocating for those with severe mental illness and substance use disorders, seeking to eliminate stigma, break down barriers, and allow access to appropriate services and treatment. Welcome, Melanie.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Allison, sorry, Allison, your last name is hard. Allison
It is.
DeVincenzi.
Perfect.
Allison DeVincenzi is a deputy district attorney who's been with Monterey County for over 2 years. In her role as a deputy DA, Allison has experience working in collaborative courts and in resolving cases with sensitive mental health issues, utilizing the county's behavioral health resources. She graduated from UC College of Law San Francisco in 2016. Thanks for being here, Allison.
Thank you very much.
And I will not try your last name again.
It's okay.
Sergeant Mickey Rubash has been with the Monterey Police Department for almost 30 years, starting as a midnight patrol officer. As an officer, Mickey served in various assignments, including the community action team, detective, field training officer, and canine handler. Mickey actually developed the department's police service dog program. Mickey was promoted to sergeant in 2016, and since January of this year, he's been assigned as the community action team supervisor. Along with Mickey, Officer Sabrina Perez has been an officer with the Monterey Police Department for 6 years and has been a member of the department's community action team, or CAT team, for 2 years. Sabrina graduated from UC Berkeley with a double major in legal studies and social welfare. She enjoys interacting with community members in Monterey and collaborating with other law enforcement and community organizations. Welcome to our police department, folks. Good to see you both.
Thank you for having us.
Well, welcome panelists, and thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. As you know, we have a series of questions, and all of our panelists, if you can go ahead and keep your cameras and mics on for us as we start the discussion, that's perfect. And Mickey, Sabrina, I'd like to just start with you. And could you just talk to us a little bit about if a family member or friend calls 911 because a loved one with mental illness is in crisis, what can they expect to happen, and what information should they provide the dispatcher if they do need to call you?
Of course. I'm going to start with the second part of the question first, because the call goes to the dispatch center. There's a criteria for the dispatch to ask a lot of questions, and the reasons they ask those questions is because it affords better opportunities for the officers to understand what they're going to be dealing with. Obviously, the questions that are going to be asked are going to be, who is this person, the description of the person, the identity of the person, what he or she is wearing, are they under the influence of possibly narcotics or alcohol, are they in proximity of any kind of weapons, who may be present with them at the location they're at, where they're at, and what triggers them, what would they respond better, or would they be welcoming to law enforcement, and questions of such. Now, obviously, once we collect that data and find out if there's any diagnosis, and find out if the person has actually mentioned suicide, if there is a mention of suicide, if there is any kind of methods mentioned, as we're responding, we're gathering all that information, we will respond with a CIT trained officer. Our department, our police chief, is adamantly insisting that when we hire officers, before they even go as a solo police officer, that they attend the training and become CIT trained officers. So we will get there, and if we have any of our civilians with us that are experts in mental health issues, we will tag along with them. We will get there, we will assess the situation and see what we can do to get this individual to the help that they need, and go from there.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Melanie, if you can expand on that, I understand there's a document that actually outlines what information families should provide first responders regarding their loved one's illness. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how the form should be used, please?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, back in 2001, there was an Assembly Bill, Assembly Bill 1424, that actually requires that individuals making decisions about initiating an involuntary hold consider collateral information from families, significant support persons about the historical course of a person's illness. And so, in collaboration with NAMI Monterey County and persons in care in the county, getting feedback on the form, behavioral health worked to develop a form that can be used, that families can fill out and have at the ready, so to speak, in advance of a crisis, and then can update that and then have that information readily available when they're calling dispatch, when first responders are responding to the home, to give them some information about their loved one, their family member. And that way, that information can go with, I would suggest filling it out and having, some copies of that to be able to give that to the first responders. So if that person is, for example, taken to an emergency room, that information can go with them to the hospital, and then the treatment team and the emergency department or whatever would also be able to have information about, medications or, triggers or what works well to help the person calm down. Those types of things as well can be included in that. And then just to piggyback a little bit on what Nikki had shared about the importance of communicating with dispatchers. I know we're going to get to mobile crisis a little bit later, but we did develop a form, a brochure actually, that our mobile crisis team did develop out of identifying the need that family members were saying, well, what should I say? What do I say when I call 911? And so we did develop a brochure and a handout that team does give out so that families can have a bit of a guide, because we understand in crisis, it's stressful. People aren't necessarily thinking super clearly or remembering things. So just trying to give some helpful information that can really help them communicate effectively in those times.
Thank you, Melanie. And I believe Jen behind the scenes actually put in chat for our attendees that AB 1424 form in both English and Spanish, and also an attachment that is sort of a summary of all the information about AB 24 in that form. So attendees feel free to grab those and download those so you have them. Melanie, while we're with you, can you tell us a little bit more about the crisis intervention team, the training that the officers attend that better prepares them for these types of responses? And I understand you actually coordinate that team.
Yeah, it's one of my passions. I'd love to talk about CIT. So CIT, or Crisis Intervention Team, is also known as the Memphis model. It was first developed in 1988 in Memphis, Tennessee, and has spread throughout the country. And locally, we've had some form of CIT Academy training here in our county since 2000. And I, as you indicated, have had the privilege of being the behavioral health coordinator and facilitator of that program since 2015. Really what CIT Academy is it's a 40-hour in 1 week immersive training experience for law enforcement. And we host law enforcement from throughout the county and sometimes from outside of the county as well when we have openings to come join us. And we base it on the CIT International model's best practices. And the basic goals of any CIT program are really to improve officer and community safety, to develop a compassionate and effective crisis response system that is the least intrusive in the person's life as possible, and to really help individuals with mental health conditions and addictive disorders access treatment, as opposed to getting further caught up in the criminal justice system due to really illness-related behaviors. So it's trying to redirect folks from the criminal justice system into the healthcare system and get them treatment to really get at the root cause of what's going on. So some of the objectives are really to help officers recognize signs and symptoms of mental illness, substance use disorders, developmental disabilities, dementia, and Alzheimer's, and kind of differentiate between some of those things. And then also practice, practice through scenario training, through have some different experiential activities, such as a voice hearing experience activity to really get a deeper understanding of some of the symptoms and struggles, challenges that our folks with lived experience deal with 24/7, 365. And learn a bit about the community resources, state resources, local resources, and some of those we're going to be talking about today. But we cover a lot of topics throughout the week and bring in individuals with lived experience to really share their stories, interact with the officers in this environment and answer their questions. And oftentimes it may be an officer's first time really interacting with someone and being able to have a conversation like this about such a heavy and serious topic, and being able to really ask those questions and get that feedback about what is helpful or not helpful for these individuals from their own personal lived experience in their times of crisis. And so it's really an exciting week and a multi-layered week, because there's really this parallel process that I see that occurs through the week where, yes, they're learning and hearing information about things that help them in their professional capacity. But as we know, we all have personal lives as well. And we also may have folks, families, friends, relatives, or whatever, that have also struggled with different things. Life is hard. And we touch on a lot of difficult subjects, including suicide prevention, trauma, and the like. And so sometimes there's a parallel process that goes on for the participants throughout the week. But it's definitely rewarding work. So thank you for asking.
Thank you for coordinating. It sounds amazing. Sabrina, let's hear from you about CIT a little bit. How you've gone through the training, you've worked in the CAT team now for a couple of years. How has CIT made a difference in the way you and your fellow officers handle these calls and situations? And how are you collaborating with mental health professionals in the field?
I found the CIT training to be very enlightening. It really just changed, at least my perspective as an officer, into understanding that there's a new way to go about policing, and it's changed over the course of the years, especially with all the information that we are learning and sharing with each other across the board from law enforcement agencies and social working agencies. So CIT is great because it gives officers a new set of tools to add to our belt to be able to really evaluate situations for what they are instead of what we may be thinking they are with the information that we've been provided. So it just reminds us that there are other options for approaching a situation. And just because we're police, we're not dealing with crimes all the time. There are a lot of times where we may be called to a scene, but a lot of times we have to just kind of take a step back and recognize this is not a criminal matter, this is a social working matter. And it is something that we can handle because people like Melanie give us the tools that we need to be able to evaluate the situations. And the CAT team is great because of the multidisciplinary outreach team that we collaborate with. We call it MDOT. It's a team of social workers and a team of officers who work together to problem solve. So these are social workers who are not employed by the city, but they come from agencies who offer time to the department to ride with us. So you will see officers now riding along with social workers, which is great because sometimes we arrive on scene to a call where police are needed, but sometimes we're really not. And having those people immediately there just means that our community gets the best type of service that we can provide and the fastest. So if we have a social worker who is specially trained to handle mental health crisis, then they take over and they will direct us to what they need. We've had social workers who say, you know what, I think this is a situation where police may escalate the situation. Why don't you take a step back? And they'll tell us, I'm comfortable with you waiting in the car. I'm comfortable with you waiting around the corner. And we work together to make that decision. And there are times where they say, I think it would be beneficial for us to go together. And then we do that. And then because we're working so close with these social workers, we are learning how to better work with their skill set to match ours. So it just, again, gives us more to work with to better assist our community. So it's been very rewarding to see how it's progressing, especially with the time that these agencies are willing to, to spend with us.
Great. Well said. Thank you. Mickey, we have attendees here from all over Monterey County and actually from other counties, neighboring counties as well. Does every law enforcement agency in Monterey County have CIT trained officers and a CAT team, or is that unique to Monterey?
I do believe that majority of police chiefs have agreed with what Sabrina just said. It is very beneficial to have CIT trained officers. The policing today is very different than policing 30 years ago. I understand that a lot of police chiefs do send their folks to training, but I think the community action team, or what we call the CAT team, currently is limited to the Monterey Police Department. We are experiencing something very new, like my partner was explaining in a minute ago. There are times that civilians are needed, and there are times that police is needed. To have both in the same car is really beneficial, because sometimes, as much as we want the civilians to approach a call, but for their safety, we may have to be there to make sure things are de-escalated, that they're safe. And then, like Sabrina said, we'll back off, we'll go into the car and sit there. So the community action team is something that's limited to the Monterey Police Department right now. And the collaboration with MDOT is something that no other agency in our county currently has that I know of. And all of our civilians, they do respond to our station and work out of our station. So we have access to them majority of the time.
Great, thank you. Melanie, you mentioned just a little while ago, the mobile crisis unit. Can you tell us what that is and how are they activated, and can a family member contact them directly instead of going through law enforcement? And I also understand there's some important changes coming up with mobile crisis, if you can talk about that as well.
Yes, this is definitely a hot topic of late. And I do want to say thank you to Monterey PD, because they have been very gracious to have our Peninsula region mobile crisis person have touchdown space in their department for many years, actually, since we really started mobile crisis, which was back in November of 2015, was when behavioral health first started having a mobile crisis team actively out in the community, the different regions of the county. And we started with 3 clinicians, one based out of each region. South County was based out of, and still is, Greenfield Police Department. And then our Peninsula person based out of Monterey PD, and our Salinas and North County region person based out of our office space over on the campus of Natividad Hospital. And so that team activated November 2015 with the hours of Wednesday through Saturday from 12:30 in the afternoon to 10 o'clock at night, and alternating Tuesdays from 1:30 in the afternoon to 10 at night. And that remains their hours to date. Mobile crisis has been able to get out in the community to really function as liaisons with law enforcement, other first responder partners, other treatment providers, both internal and external, to behavioral health, and provide that sort of specialized assistance in responding to individuals and families in crisis. I mean, this is what they do for their job. And so they're out there in the community, getting to know the resources and the nuances of the different regions of the community and building relationships. You know, they collaborate, they work collaboratively with lots of partners, and their view of team is very multidisciplinary because often they may be the only clinician or the only behavioral health provider on a scene. And so the perspective that they're able to bring in terms of recognizing the signs of psychiatric, you know, distress, resources, helping to de-escalate, to calm situations down, and to really know the resources and to help link people to voluntary services in the community, but also to assess and do those critical crisis risk and safety assessments. And if somebody truly is in need of being hospitalized, to really help facilitate that process in the most trauma-informed and sensitive, communicating with, you know, if it's the first responders, the ambulance providers, the hospital, you know, for that continuity of care for that patient coming to the hospital. You know, we really try to stabilize in the community and divert from those resources, but there are times when that is what's clinically indicated, is to help get somebody to that higher level of care. And then that providing that communication is really key and important, and something that they can really help with. And then also with any follow-up or support that is needed for maybe families or other significant supports who may also be there, and also provide resources to them in terms of connecting to some community supports for those folks. Our team is really activated in a few different ways to answer the next part of your question. When mobile crisis first started, really the model at that time was really about co-responder models and behavioral health staff responding out with police, sometimes in the same unit and sometimes just being dispatched out through 911 in response to emergency calls for service. And so that was initially how our model got set up. And so our team does respond out to calls that come through 911, and at the request of law enforcement, they will respond out and they will meet them out there. And actually, just in looking at our data, still to this day, like looking at from the time we became operational through the end of last year, about 41% of our calls for service still come through computer-aided dispatch or through the 911 system. So that's definitely one of the primary ways our team gets activated. But additionally, we receive referrals. So we can receive, we're not operational 24/7 yet. You know, so we receive referrals. We receive referrals from our law enforcement partners, from other treatment providers. They will fill out a form and send that in by email, and then our team will follow up. And clearly those are for non-emergency referrals. But just, you know, if they're having some frequent contacts with individuals in the community that they're like, gosh, you know, this person, you know, maybe there's something else that we can do here, you know, they'll consult and we'll try and see what we can do on our end to outreach and engage and provide some information on resources and maybe help get that person in for an assessment or to get connected to some appropriate services. And so we also respond to other non-emergency calls that may come through our behavioral health crisis line. So we do have our behavioral health community crisis team that can be reached for just, you know, some phone support, like if you're calling the suicide prevention lifeline, you know, if you're in crisis and struggling. And then also we've really been working to try and connect that so that the community has an option outside of waiting for something to rise to the level of 911 to really reach out. And if our mobile crisis staff is operational at that time, to be able to go out and provide some additional support when that's appropriate, we can do that. as well. But the behavioral health mobile crisis team isn't the only mobile crisis response that's available in our county. We also have our Seneca Children and Youth Mobile Response Team, behavioral health in partnership with our contracted provider, Seneca, some years ago developed the mobile response team specific for children and youth. And they actually launched during the pandemic. They started in July 2020. And the focus of MRT is really on children and youth ages 0 to 21 and their families. And so they can provide some ongoing sort of like wraparound support, try and help stabilize the youth in the community with their family, provide those resources, and a little bit differently than our behavioral health mobile crisis team, the Seneca program can really work with family into other treatment providers. And so since they've actually been operational from July 2020 through December of last year, they've received a total of 6,172 calls, of which about 15% or 931 of those calls were actually crisis calls. So the majority of the calls that they receive are not necessarily crisis calls resulting in a mobile crisis response, although that is a possibility, but they do receive a lot of calls for support from the community for families, and then they're able to respond out.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Great information. I do want to mention that Derek, thank you, Derek, sent us a message that the city of Seaside has its own family and community support program that provides mobile crisis response in direct partnership with the police and fire departments in Seaside, and they also provide social services to the community. So thank you, Derek, for that information. We really appreciate it. Let's turn to our attorneys on the panel. Allison and Michelle. Allison, if someone with a serious mental illness does get arrested for a crime, how does the district attorney's office determine whether or not to file criminal charges against them?
Right. So when we file charges, we don't actually take into consideration mental health or defenses. A reason for that being that we have to remain objective. Also, we cannot make a determination as to somebody's mental health. That is really left to the experts. So because of that, we file based off of the evidence presented to us.
And so the mental health component would come in after the filing then, is that right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Perfect. We know it's not just ignored. I just wanted to clarify
No,
that.
yes, of course.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of the judicial process, is that a lot of those mitigating factors do come out. But in just the filing of the charges, we really have to remain objective and really file based off of the evidence.
Thank you. Michelle, what's the role of the public defender's office and the public defender when you represent clients who have a serious illness, serious mental illness, and are also charged with a crime?
Thank you, Deb. I'm going to go back to kind of the beginning of that question of what is the role of the public defender when representing clients. So one of the rights of the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to counsel when one is charged with a criminal offense. And public defenders are fully licensed attorneys whose sole job is to represent any person who is not financially able to employ counsel and who is charged with any criminal or juvenile delinquency case. In addition, the public defender also represents proposed conservatees in mental health cases and persons accused of contempt in civil cases, plus much more. The main roles and responsibilities of a public defender are providing legal representation, consultation, and advice to clients, representing them through the entire criminal proceeding, which involves working closely with them, discussing relevant information, strategies, defenses, and what kind of offers may be on the case. We also create a defense plan with our clients. We do investigative legal research, general investigation of accusations, the gathering of records, both medical, mental health, and also school records. And we interview any necessary witnesses, which could involve family members. The one thing to remember is public defenders are still attorneys, and we must maintain confidentiality, which is commonly referred to as the attorney-client privilege. This means that communications between an attorney and client are confidential, and only the client may waive the privilege. So when a client has a serious mental illness or it does not change the role and responsibility of the public defender. However, these are additional considerations when representing individuals with a serious mental illness. But a lawyer must listen to their client's objectives and wishes, even for those with a serious mental illness. The Monterey County Office of the Public Defender specifically considers a holistic approach to provide support for the whole person. Yet it's the client who ultimately is responsible for the option chosen. The incarceration of individuals, from what we've noticed, with mental illness represents a significant public health crisis. Individuals with mental health needs are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and they experience worse outcomes when they come in contact with the justice system than those without psychiatric conditions. So theorizing that untreated mental illness is the root of criminal justice involvement for many people, the courts are increasingly accounting for individuals' mental health needs as part of the case, determination of alternatives to incarceration, sentencing, and/or detention decisions. So as the defendant's primary advocates, public defenders are an essential component of the treatment-led response. We are routinely called upon to determine which of the clients would benefit from treatment, the extent to which defendants with mental illness are equipped to make decisions that are in their own best interest, competency-related issues, is the client competent to proceed on the criminal action or not, and the appropriate balance between individual autonomy and treatment needs. Defense attorneys, specifically public defenders, and those accused of criminal offenses make decisions jointly that are related to the client's mental health needs, particularly in raising mental illness in court and advocating for treatment-based alternatives to incarceration.
And Michelle, what are, and certainly Allison, if you want to pipe in, what are those programs, or what programs do exist that offer an alternative to incarceration when someone with mental illness has committed a crime, and how do you determine who's eligible for those programs?
So in Monterey County, there are 3 main programs. The first one is not really mental health related, but that's pretrial diversion. It's for misdemeanor offenses only, and it's a judge at their discretion, even over the objection of the prosecuting attorney, could offer diversion to an individual. Diversion would be for a period not to exceed 24 months, and the court could order the defendant to comply with terms and conditions that the judge deems appropriate. If the defendant has complied at the end of that diversionary period, the case is dismissed. And there are certain offenses under that particular code section, the pretrial diversion, that a person may not be diverted for, such as those requiring sex offender registration, domestic violence, and stalking. Then we get to another pretrial diversion program, which is specifically mental health diversion. There are eligibility and suitability requirements that are outlined in the code. Mainly, does the client have a qualifying mental health disorder as identified in the most recent edition of the DSM? Does the client have antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, or pedophilia? Those disorders are specifically excluded from mental health diversion. The second eligibility criteria is for those who have been diagnosed or treated for the diagnosed mental disorder within the past 5 years.
And Michelle,
yes.
I'm sorry, let me interrupt just a second. We have a request from our interpreters. If you could slow down just a little bit for them, please.
I just saw that.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So if an individual meets the eligibility requirements for mental health diversion, the courts then move into the suitability requirements. And the suitability requirements, well, one additional eligibility requirement was the mental health disorder a significant factor in the commission of the offense? The law changed at the beginning of this year, which essentially states now that the court shall find, if the individual has a mental health disorder, that it was a significant factor unless there's clear and convincing evidence to state otherwise. So once the eligibility criteria is met, we move to suitability. The suitability criteria covers, would the mental health disorder respond to treatment? Does the client consent to treatment, agree to comply with treatment, and consent to the diversion process? The last eligibility criteria: does the individual pose an unreasonable risk of danger to public safety if treated in the community? I won't go into details about what that entails, but those are the eligibility and suitability requirements. If somebody meets all of the requirements, they may be diverted under mental health diversion. Misdemeanors may be diverted for 1 year and felonies for 2 years. If an individual completes mental health diversion successfully, the case is dismissed and the arrest record is sealed. The last program that we have that's an alternative to incarceration in Monterey County is the Creating New Choices program, which is a collaborative mental health court, but it's not pre-trial, it's post-plea. So the other two programs I discussed both do not involve a plea to the criminal offense. The Creating New Choices does require a plea, and it is a voluntary, comprehensive, court-supervised program for nonviolent justice-involved individuals who have a primary qualifying mental health diagnosis. The requirements are tailored to an individual's needs as determined through a comprehensive medical and mental health assessment. These requirements typically include regular court appearances, formal probation, treatment, either inpatient or outpatient or both, drug and alcohol testing, peer groups, counseling, vocational training, education, or job placement, and housing assistance. Graduates from this program can receive a dismissal of their case under a different code section than what the pretrial diversion programs offer.
Great, thank you. And Michelle, we have a quick question. Do you know the code section for the new diversion law? Somebody would like to research that further?
Yes, it's penal. The mental health diversion is Penal Code Section 1001.36. The pretrial diversion is Penal Code Section 1001.95. And the Creating New Choices is a collaborative court just in Monterey County.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And attendees, we very much appreciate you putting your questions in the Q&A portion. Please know that if I don't ask them during our panel discussion, we do have time carved out at the end. So I'm not ignoring you. We're monitoring that continuously. But thank you for the questions that you have posted. Allison, how we know that there was a fairly recent change with Senate Bill 317 that changed the incompetent to stand trial law. How do you manage expectations of family members and friends, loved ones of those who are arrested that have a serious mental illness in light of that change specifically to misdemeanors?
So it's really just having candid conversations with the family members and friends about the limitations of, about the law, and then the limitations on services. Also the limitations of the district attorney's office. We prosecute crimes, but we are not the best at servicing mental health issues. So we really just, we're honest with them. And I think another thing is really having a good working relationship with Michelle Wooden and the public defender's office, because we really heavily rely on them to get information from the family and friends, because it's often the public defender's office that has that closer connection to the one being accused and the family members. So just having that connection helps as well.
And my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that Senate bill removed the ability to compel competency when somebody is prosecuted for a misdemeanor. Is that correct? Versus felony, where there is a process to do that. Am I describing that correctly, or can you clarify that?
So I know that within misdemeanors, if somebody is declared incompetent to stand trial, essentially they cannot be brought back to competency for misdemeanor purposes. For felony purposes, they can be.
And so that would sort of inject a treatment component if they're facing felony charges. But I know sometimes it's frustrating for family members, because if it's misdemeanor charges, there's really nothing that
Correct.
can be done with
Correct.
that. Yeah, unless the person is voluntarily entering services.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. And that's again the candid conversations we do have with them about the limitations of the law.
Thank you. Michelle, do you want to add anything to that or clarify anything?
Yeah, I as well receive calls from family members who are asking why their loved one who happens to be in custody. And I saw that there was a question in the chat. So if I can just step back on that, Deb, for just a moment, because it addresses the competency aspect. If an individual is found incompetent on a misdemeanor case, as Allison said, there is no restoration process any longer. Senate Bill 317 changed Penal Code 1370.01 and basically said, look, we want alternatives to incarceration for individuals who are incompetent. Now, the competency aspect only deals with that case. We're evaluating, are they competent to proceed to trial on that case? So if an individual is deemed incompetent on that case, picks up another case, they may be competent at the time that they're evaluated because the evaluations are per case. So if an individual in a misdemeanor case is found incompetent, they are given the option where the court has to hold a hearing to determine if they're eligible for mental health diversion. If not eligible, the court can determine if they meet the grave disability standard, or the court can dismiss the case. And unfortunately, that's the position that we find ourselves in. So expectations for the family. I do a lot of education on the law, explaining the limitations. I provide the known resources, and really it's just a listening ear. What I tell families is, don't give up on your loved ones. We have to keep working on this together in order to encourage them to attend treatment.
Thank you. Michelle, while we have you, what's the best way a family member can help get their loved one into an alternative program if they are arrested and they suffer from a serious mental illness?
Well, there really is no one size solution fits all for helping a family member or a friend who has a mental illness. But the research shows that family support does play a major role in helping a loved one with mental health issues. When a family member or friend is experiencing mental health issues, it can affect more than just the person in need of recovery. Evidence has shown that some people have a genetic predisposition for developing mental health disorders and may be at greater risk based on environmental factors, such as having grown up in a home affected by a family member's mental health history, or even substance abuse. Families should be open to the options of support groups with family therapy and counseling, which can improve treatment effectiveness by supporting the whole family. But it's also important to remember that the unique challenges that come from helping a loved one with a mental health or even a substance use disorder can be taxing. So caregivers should take steps to prioritize their own health. Family members may be more likely to notice when their loved ones are experiencing changes in mood or behavior. And being able to offer support, they can connect those in need with treatment, resources, and services to begin and stay on their recovery journey. In our work, if the family member or friend with a serious mental illness becomes just as involved, we ask families to do the following: to please provide background and historical information about the client, to provide any family history of mental health or substance use disorders, if they have any records of psychiatric care or substance use treatment, including medication records, any information that they would believe that could assist in their case, and then how to best communicate with the client. Families and friends know clients better than we do when we first meet them. Are there triggers? Are there topics we should stay away from? We need to know that so that we know how best to help an individual. Does showing a picture of their child help them want to seek treatment? What can we do to help? We need the family support on that. But I need everybody to remember that the lawyer for the accused may receive information, yet may not be able to disseminate that information unless we receive consent. We are like one-way streets. Information only goes in one direction. But please, and I tell family members this almost on a daily basis, don't let that discourage you from providing information. Even if there is consent given though, there is occasion when the lawyer may not choose to disseminate that information. So if for instance, if a client is incompetent and says, yeah, you can talk to my family, we may not choose because that's not a knowing consent.
Thank you. It's a really important point. Melanie, if somebody is arrested and they're incarcerated in the county jail or in an alternative court program, what mental health treatment is available to those individuals?
That's a great question. We get this question a lot. Behavioral health does not provide the mental health services in the county jail. That's actually WellPath. who is the sheriff's office contracted provider for medical, dental, and mental health services in the jail. They actually have licensed social workers on staff, psychiatrists on staff, as well as other healthcare professionals. They can do the med management, they dispense meds, the whole gamut. And so there is also a form that families should know about, support folks should know about, that they can use to provide information to WellPath if their loved one does get arrested and find themselves in the county jail. And that's available on the sheriff's office website. And they can provide that information and submit that electronically. I believe there's also a form that they can fill out or print out and submit that way. But it's just really important to communicate that, because oftentimes when individuals may be booked, and they're getting screened, they may not disclose that they have an underlying mental health condition, or that might not be evident at time of booking. And so if WellPath does become aware of that, they can make a point to make the rounds and check in with that person and get that person on their list for the follow-up. So it's really important, especially, we have individuals who may be on long-acting injectable medication in the community. And so that medication might be holding them for a while, but then when that medication wears off, if they're still in custody and they didn't get that next dose, there may start to be some symptoms or behavioral changes that are noticed. And so really to try and get ahead of that, folks can communicate to WellPath. So there is treatment in the jail. I just want to reassure people of that. And we communicate, we have, relationship with the sheriff's office and WellPath. When we find out that, individuals are in the jail who have been receiving treatment with us, we have workflows in place where we can communicate that important medication information to them. And then they also send referrals back to us when they're aware individuals are going to be released. So we've been really working on bridging that communication so folks don't fall through the cracks. So that's one thing. The other piece is in the county jail, there is also medication assisted treatment, MAT for short. And we have been working in collaboration and partnership with WellPath and the Sheriff's Office to expand medication assisted treatment that's available in the county jail. And so that's another one of the collaborations that we have with them, really to not just continue medication if folks are maybe receiving that in the community and then go into custody, but really to identify folks while they're in custody, get them assessed and get them started on that, and get the counseling, not just, have access to the medication, but the counseling and all the other things that go along with that. And then do that warm handoff back to the community, to a community provider who can continue that, so we can try and, reduce the numbers of overdoses that we're seeing in our community. So that's another program that goes on in the county jail and that we're collaborating around. And then they do have a jail-based competency restoration program for felonies, JBCT, also in our local jail that serves the Tri-County area. And so oftentimes we'll see some of the felony incompetent to stand trial clients go into the JBCT for some stabilization and then come back out without really leaving the jail. So there's that program. And then in addition to, some of those programs, there are other educational and vocational and types of programming for sentenced individuals who are serving their time there. I did just want to piggyback a little bit on something Michelle said, if I can, in terms of the alternative court programs. Behavioral health is involved in those. And she referenced one of our collaborative court programs, but I also do want to let folks know that we have a number of collaborative court programs in addition to creating new choices or our mental health treatment court. We have our drug treatment court, our DUI court, veterans treatment court, military diversion. So there's a lot of programming that's available through the collaborative court programs, and each of them have different eligibility criteria and things like that. But if we're really talking about individuals with behavioral health needs, I also want to just make sure that folks know that there's alternatives for those that are struggling with addiction issues or to drugs or alcohol through the court programs as well. And then we have been spending all of our time really talking about adults, but I do want to give a shout out to our juvenile justice behavioral health programs, because we also do have collaborations with probation and the courts. In our juvenile justice programs, there's also CALA Court, which is the Juvenile Mental Health Treatment Court. They also have a drug court and a juvenile sex offender treatment court program. So there's behavioral health overlaps a lot with regards to justice involved individuals. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Melanie, we actually have a couple of questions that just came in with regard to jail medication. A couple of our attendees want to know, how soon after somebody enters the county jail will they get access to medication? What's that process like?
So I think the first part of that is they need to be identified at booking that they need that. So if it's somebody who is new, maybe it's their first time coming into jail, if they're not saying, I have a medical condition or I have a mental health condition and I need my medication, these are, then they might not get on WellPath's radar, right? That's an issue. And so I think that's why it's so important for family members, loved ones, if you know that somebody got arrested, to go on the sheriff's office website, to fill out that form, to communicate with WellPath, or call into the jail and ask to talk to somebody from WellPath. They'll probably get you on the phone with a nurse or someone, but then you can at least, tell them, about that, and then they can follow up on their end. If it's somebody who's known to them and that they've seen before, they can kind of know that they're back. And if they've seen them before and give them medication before, then they will definitely have a flag on that and will be able to do that. But I think the piece with that is there's also consent. The person has to consent to also receiving the medications. And so absent consent and their willingness to take the medications, they don't force medicate in the county jail. So.
Thank you, Melanie. And Jen posted in the chat links to the Monterey Sheriff inmate medical information form and some other links. So I encourage our attendees to take a look at that as well. And I think, Melanie, I think you alluded to this. Someone asked how a family member can check on or have the in-house staff check on a mental health patient who is incarcerated. They can call and check, but I think what Michelle said is really, really important here is the information is very often a one-way street. It's important for family members to provide that information, but unless the person incarcerated has provided consent for the information to be shared back with family members, they won't be able to really tell you much. Is that correct?
100%. And it's the same way with behavioral health too. So I really like Michelle's analogy of the one-way street, because that's often what it feels like. And especially when we're dealing with adults, it's if they're not providing consent or authorization for us to disclose any information, we can't even really acknowledge that we know them. So it can kind of feel like a really awkward kind of conversation, but we always can receive information, even if we can't give information. And so when we do receive information, we definitely do look into it on our back end and then do whatever we can do to outreach and engage if somebody's in the community or if they're in jail, communicate that way, and to make sure that, we're doing our due diligence on our end.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Mickey, Sabrina, let's turn back to you for a second. If a family member has a loved one who has a serious mental illness and that they feel at some point they may need to call law enforcement or have emergency response, how can they make law enforcement aware of that in advance, and how can they prepare for that?
So like we were just discussing, I think communication is the key to everything. We have 24/7 records personnel at our police department. The family members obviously can call ahead of time and give us some information as to the person that we were going to be dealing with, what kind of diagnosis they have again, what kind of medication they may be on, what triggers them, what calms them down. And what we do is we collect all of that information and we put them into our system. Now, when an officer gets dispatched, that officer has a laptop in the patrol vehicle and they can access all of that information as they're en route to the call.
Perfect. Thank you. That's really, really important. And we appreciate that information. So good information for family members to let their local police department know what's going on in advance if you think you might need their services. Allison, I'm hoping you can answer this. If not, maybe Michelle, or Mickey. Can you tell us what a gun violence restraining order is, also known as California's red flag law, and how does it pertain to family members of those with serious mental illness? And how can a family member obtain such an order if they're concerned about their loved one possessing firearms?
Sure. So a common theme with this whole presentation is really that family and friends and loved ones have oftentimes the most information about individuals' mental health and some struggles that they're going through. So really the gun violence restraining order empowers family or friends to, if they're seeing someone who could possibly be a threat to themselves or a threat to others, they can actually take action into their own hands and make sure that that person doesn't have access to guns or firearms or ammunition. So there are different ways they can go about doing that. They can file a gun restraining order with the court themselves. I know my office recommends that people go through law enforcement, where they can file a report with a law enforcement agency, and then that agency can then seek an emergency gun violence restraining order with a judge. And then that emergency restraining order will be in place up to 21 days. And then there will be a hearing afterwards. And that at that hearing, the friends and family can then appeal to the judge with more information as to why this would be the safest route for their loved one.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And Jen just put a link in chat to the Monterey court page that talks a little bit more about restraining orders. So if anybody's interested, they can click on that link and read more about it. The gun violence restraining order is a really important tool that families can use to reduce the potential of violence and of suicide. Melanie, can you just take a couple minutes and tell us if there are any new initiatives on the horizon to help individuals with serious mental illness in the criminal justice system? And then after that, attendees will get to your questions.
Wow, this is a big question. So I'll just give like the highlights, because there's a ton of initiatives. I mean, I think if anybody's, watching the news or anything of late, like they're probably hearing about some of these. One of them being CARE Act, or Community Assistance Recovery and Empowerment Act, also known as SB 1338, which was approved by the governor back in September of last year. And really, it is a new civil court process that's designed to connect individuals with certain mental health diagnoses, not opened up wide, but certain mental health diagnoses over a 1 to 2 year process with county behavioral health services under the oversight of a judge. So different than some of the other courts that we've been talking about our collaborative courts, which are really criminal courts. And in the criminal court process, Care Court or the Care Act, this civil court process is not criminal. So it is in the first phase of rollout. There are 7 counties that are, I believe 7 counties that are rolling it out and needing to work towards implementation by the end of this year. And then the remaining counties in the state, including Monterey, will be in the next round, which will be implementation by December 1st of 2024. There is a lot of litigation going on about this. We're watching it very closely to see how all of that plays out, and then also learn from what some of these first round counties have found in terms of implementation. So that's one really big area. The other thing is CalAIM for the justice involved in particular, I think really focuses on our conversation tonight. But, CalAIM for the justice involved, I mean, historically, there has been the inmate exclusion part of Medi-Cal billing. So meaning community providers have not been able to go into the county jail and provide services to folks who are in custody. And so there has oftentimes been a difficulty in bridging that gap from custody to community transition. So CalAIM is really changing everything in the behavioral health landscape right now. And 2 big pieces for the justice involved that are really relevant to this conversation are the changes to Medi-Cal rules. So folks are getting enrolled in Medi-Cal, are being identified while they're in custody, getting enrolled in Medi-Cal, those who are eligible while they're in custody. For folks who have Medi-Cal already in the community and go into custody, their benefits are not getting discontinued. They are being put in more of a held or suspended status, and then very easily reactivated upon release. And so that person then can go fill that prescription that they have for medication from the WellPath provider and not go without medications. That person can go back to their community-based treatment provider and start receiving services again without worried about, not having a way to pay for it. And so that's one piece of it. The second piece of it that is very exciting to me, having worked in forensics for a number of years, is the 90-day in-reach component, where we're really going to be able to connect and work with WellPath and the providers to identify folks who really need specialty mental health services upon release into the community, and then start to work with them on discharge planning, referrals, those types of things while they're still in jail up to 90 days pre-release. So those are 2 big components of that. Really, really quick. We also have the Stepping Up initiative, which the County Board of Supervisors passed a Stepping Up resolution back in April of 2019. Stepping Up is a national movement. If you don't know about it, it's pretty exciting. It's very collaborative. It pulls all of this together, and it's very much in line with the conversation tonight. We did a big countywide system mapping project. There is a final report with some, recommendations that came out of it, but really the whole initiative is about how do we look at reducing bookings for folks with behavioral health needs in county jails, reducing average lengths of stay, increasing connections to care and treatment, and reducing recidivism for this population. So I believe Jen was going to pop the report into the chat, so I hope folks take a minute to look at that. And the last one, and then I'll stop, is the psychiatric advanced directives. There is a currently ongoing a multi-county innovation project that's statewide, that's funded by the Mental Health Services Act, also known as Prop 63, that 7 counties, including Monterey, are involved in. And it's really looking at, just like we have medical advanced directives for our physical health care, this is kind of that psychiatric advanced directive counterpart to that. And there is a link with a lot of information about
Whoops.
project, but really it's looking can really outline their preferences for times of crisis.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. And welcome to Dr. Q, who's joined the panel back as we address some of our attendee questions. Melanie, I think you touched on that, and maybe Dr. Q, you can touched on this, and maybe Dr. Q, you can add in as well. As Rosa wants to know that when a person leaves jail, do they receive wraparound services? And is there collaboration between the doctor, social worker, courts, treatment providers to keep that person from going back into jail? And I know interim actually provides some of those services. So can either of you kind of weigh in on what those wraparound services look like?
Sure, I can start, and then yes, behavioral health is in communication with WellPath. WellPath can identify folks and send referrals to us for folks who are getting out. I think one of the challenges of the reality of a jail setting is we don't always know when somebody's going to be getting released. They might be in a sort of a pretrial status and then go to court one day and the judge is like, okay, you're going to be released. And so what we've done, at least in terms of some of the courts that I know Michelle and Allison have really been talking about, our collaborative courts, our mental health diversion, those types of courts, is we've been really trying to work with the court to plan that. Like if you're going to order them to be released, at least like order them tomorrow morning instead of, tonight, where they might get out at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Like order them tomorrow morning when, okay, our clinics are open, we can try and connect them with behavioral health services. So we've been really trying to do some of those warm handoffs, if you will, between custody and community. But I think a key point that we need to really acknowledge is that when we're talking about adults, there's a voluntary nature to all of this. They have to be willing, they have to be agreeable. We do our best to outreach and engage, and people can still say no. So that is a piece of it. And so we have even had people where the stars have aligned. I worked with the sheriff's office. They did the courtesy transport literally from the county jail to building 400 at Natividad. I had staff downstairs meeting them at the transport van. The folks got out. We're like, hi, glad you're here, and they're like, yeah, I'm good, bye, and walked away. And we can't force treatment.
And just to add to that, in terms of continuity of care, so Interim has 2 crisis residential programs, one in Salinas and one in Monterey, 28 beds in total. And so when someone's involved with the criminal justice system, like Melanie was saying, say is in jail, maybe time is up, maybe they're not in the space or have the resources, or just not totally ready to be out on their own in the community. Crisis residential was a great short-term program as a step down into the community, where they receive individual group services, medication support, if that's needed. And we really work with either interim counselors or case managers, or they're usually opened up to Monterey County Behavioral Health outpatient teams. And we really try to wrap around them. And these are 30-day short-term programs. However, there is a maximum of 89 days or so, depending on how well they're progressing through these treatment programs. But it's quite the collaborative effort, and we find very, very good success, because the last thing what we want to do is create a cycle of community incarceration back and forth and back and forth. We want to ensure that we provide them as many resources and get them well and stabilized, if you will, as much as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have several, not sure how many, but a number of professionals that are attending our webinar tonight, including social workers and county workers. And one of the social workers asked, how do you help someone who's hesitant in getting a diagnosis because of them and has mental health issues because they're afraid of being treated differently by the police? And Mickey, I know you talked about the importance of family members letting the police know ahead of time. So there is something sort of in the record if they do need to be called. Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, is that a good thing? Is there an advantage to that? I can understand the fear that somebody may have of getting a diagnosis because they are afraid of being treated differently. You want to address that?
Of course, yes. I mean, that is a huge concern. But for the family members, I think it's really helpful because certain individuals with different diagnoses respond differently to different things. Sometimes we get requests where we trying to help an individual and they just don't want to hear the light and siren coming towards the house. Sometimes the approach to the house would be a question. Sometimes they may want to see a civilian maybe first before they see the police. So if we have that information in our system, it really helps us to help them and put them at ease and de-escalate the situation. I understand what you're saying, but I think the benefits outweigh the negatives.
I think it's also important to recognize that, especially with our the police department in Monterey, we have a whole team of officers who are dedicated to building rapport with individuals in our community who could better use the social services. So if you have a family member who may be concerned about police interaction in the future, if they're having a better day, it wouldn't hurt to ask them if they wanted to just talk to us and chat on one of those better days. And we find ourselves trying to build rapport with people before we really need to talk to them. That way, when they are in a mental health crisis or they are in a situation where police are being called, they're familiar with us and we're no longer strangers, and they learn that they can trust us because we're putting in that effort. But it really does fall on us to make that effort and to take that initiative to say, we are going to interact with them on a personal level where it's not an officer and a citizen, it's two community members, getting to know each other and sharing information on how we can help each other in the future.
And I just wanted to add that this is something new that we are working on, and I think it's going to become popular among the police departments. I know we are talking about mental health, but we have other civilians that work with us. We have a domestic violence advocate that works with us. We have individuals from the hospital that works with us. We have people from Adult Protective Services. So like what Sabrina was saying, it's building a relationship with individuals before they're in that stage and recognizing what would de-escalate the situation.
Thank you. And I also know that somebody being willing to get a formal diagnosis does open up the opportunity for treatment and services that they may not be eligible for without a diagnosis.
And Deb, if I could maybe comment to maybe an iteration of that type of question in particular. So,
and Dr. Q, really quick before you do, I know that we just lost power at the interim building, so the webinar is still up and running, but I think the storm is starting to hit in earnest. So we're going to keep going because we have several more questions, and we're committed to 7 o'clock. If for some reason we lose this webinar, I want to thank everybody in advance very quickly. So Dr. Q, take it away.
Sure. So I think that, approaching a person in that kind of situation too is just try to balance respecting their boundaries and wishes with empathic persistence. That will vary depending on the person you're working with. Patience is key. Continuing to outreach and engage. Sometimes just being present is all the support they need at that time. Maybe that's all they want, and it's okay. Sometimes it takes months to years to engage someone into optimizing the resources before them, if you will, and they might not even know what's before them, what they have access to. Also, sometimes, having someone with lived experience like a wellness navigator or another peer support, they may serve beneficial, engaging them into services, or at the least be amenable to available resources. So I just wanted to answer that maybe in a different way.
Perfect. Thank you. Great information for our social worker who posed the question. I'm not sure who best to answer this, but we are a large veterans community. And one of our attendees asked if there's collaboration between the VA and Monterey County Behavioral Health and Monterey County Services to assist with veterans who may be arrested with mental health issues. And probably Melanie, you're the best person to answer that one.
Yeah, and I'm nodding my head because yes, we definitely do collaborate with the VA. We also have Monterey County Offices of Veterans Affairs. We have our Veterans Treatment Court and Military Diversion Collaborative Court. So in speaking of relationships and building relationships, we we definitely do that with the jail, the public defender, the DA's office, and then also depending on the specific collaborative court, we also bring in the VA, Veterans Transition Center as well. And so I do know that the VA does go into the jail and does see folks. The sheriff's office does actively also work to connect veterans who come into custody with the VA. They have one of their deputies, who I believe is now sergeant, is tasked with that as well, to do some of that work. And so, yes, there is a collaboration amongst sort of all of us around there in getting folks connected with the resources that they need.
Great, thank you. Really important. I think this is a question for Allison. If for felonies, if someone has not been diagnosed or treated within the last 5 years, can they still qualify for pretrial diversion?
So
I see Michelle smiling as well. So between the two of you, I know there's an answer.
Allison,
so
do you want me to take it first?
Yeah, sure. I'll go for that.
Okay, so the code actually states that in opining that a defendant suffers from a qualifying disorder, the qualified mental health expert may rely on an examination of the defendant's medical records, arrest reports, or any other evidence. The code says, has the defendant been diagnosed or treated for the diagnosed mental disorder within the past 5 years? It doesn't say the past 5 years prior to arrest. Sometimes we get individuals who have never been diagnosed before. They come into custody and they then get diagnosed and begin to get treated. We take that on the defense side as within the past 5 years, and we file our petitions there. So there is some practice tips on this and stuff that we try to do, because there are individuals who have not been diagnosed and aren't diagnosed till they do come into custody. So that's felonies or misdemeanors.
Thank you. Allison, anything to add to that, or?
No, Michelle always puts everything perfectly in, especially with that particular subject. Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you,
Thank you. Thank you. And I know somebody earlier mentioned traumatic brain injuries, and I think in the context of the CIT training is how to tell the difference, which can sometimes be quite difficult. So how are people with traumatic brain injuries dealt with, and how many doctors need to evaluate somebody with a traumatic brain injury to determine competency? Do any of you know the
If we're
answer?
talking about the justice involved, individuals who are in custody or been charged with a crime, if the defense declares a doubt, the court shall appoint at least one doctor and shall appoint two if the defense is requesting a finding of competence. So it only takes one doctor to evaluate competency if someone is competent to proceed on the criminal case.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I'll just add that, as Michelle said, it's usually an illness evaluator, and there are a number of different psychometrics and measures that are utilized to come to a conclusion of whether or not someone is competent to stand trial or not due to a mental illness. But it's not just the tools, it's definitely information from any support that they have, any previous records. Usually folks are in custody when they're evaluated. So ensuring there's information from any, staff who's working in the jail, whether it's WellPath here in this county or other officers. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
While we have a little bit of time left, Melanie, I know that we wanted to loop back. You wanted to mention some changes coming up with mobile crisis, and I think that's really important. Can you describe that for us?
Sure. So mobile crisis, Department of Healthcare Services with the state of California is issued a information notice to the counties back in December that is really mandating expansion of mobile crisis services in all of the counties around the state, that we're all to be moving towards 24/7, 365 mobile crisis response capabilities. And in their guidance to the counties, it really is very specific and outlines the criteria. They also there's also a new mobile crisis Medi-Cal benefit that is being put in place for reimbursement for these services, because with mobile crisis we respond to anybody regardless of payer source. It's like if there's a need, we get a call, and it's clinically appropriate, like we're responding. So they're really requiring 2-person teams outside of law enforcement. So there's really the pendulum with mobile crisis has kind of swung a little bit. You might remember I mentioned the co-responder model back in 2015 when we first started, and that was the big push then. Now it's really around behavioral health being able to respond independently of law enforcement in 2-person teams, and only involving law enforcement when there is an identified safety risk. So if we get a call, somebody's assaulting somebody, or there's a weapon involved, we're not sending our staff out to that, like without, law enforcement partners present. But DHCS is really still saying, like, we need to be sending out 2 of our staff. And so who can make up that team? They've given us some pretty clear guidance on that as well. And it can be comprised of some different types of folks, licensed eligible clinicians, but also peers, also paramedics or EMTs, peer support specialists. There's a whole curriculum being in certification process being developed in that area as well. And so just really looking at who can comprise the team, also looking at including substance use counselors as part of that too. So there's lots of changes with mobile crisis going on.
That's exciting. Thank you, Melody. That is all the time we have for questions. We will make the recording of this available. I'm not quite sure how, probably on the interim website. So check there. And so thank you very much to all of our panelists for sharing their incredible experience in time, especially on a stormy night. And I'd now like to reintroduce Dr. Kitan for closing remarks. Dr. Q.
Thank you, Deb. I want to again thank everyone in attendance this evening and hope that this webinar was a benefit to you. Thank you to all the panelists and your continued partnership with Interim and your service to our community. I want to encourage folks to visit Interim's website at www.interiminc.org to learn more about our programs and services, ways you can support Interim through volunteer opportunities and donations if interested. And if anyone's looking for a job, we also have a list of career opportunities on our website. Thank you all again. Be safe and keep well.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
And
you.
panelists, thank you so much.
Great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.